Okay, if you guys can also go to the window and go to the Midi Editor, if you can open the Midi Editor, then what you'll see here, that plays an important function in allowing us to very easily work with these items, is the Midi editing window itself. And this will require a little bit of discussion as well before we really get into doing step input. With the Midi Editor, there's one function that we do have to highlight and keep in mind. And it's that if the Midi Editor basically shows us the piano roll and actual key positions of where the Midi items actually reside. And it allows us to get in and manually draw notes if we need to, create notes through this means. We can go in and edit notes, we can quantize, we can do a lot of the functions that we want to do. Here's the trick. The real trick with this is just like in the edit and mix window, there's a track listing. And if the dot alongside of an actual track is not dark gray, then it won't be seen in the mixer edit window. And the same thing happens for the Midi Editor. So if this little guy is not selected, which of course you can't deselect it now, but once you have more than one, if this isn't selected, then that's not who's being represented. And furthermore, I'm just going to show you this as an example. I'm going to create a few more instrument tracks. So notice right now, which instrument is actually being seen in the Midi Editor? Yeah, instrument 1. Now, at the same time, you can actually reveal all of these so they layer over top of each other, which is cool, but at the same time, this pencil represents the one that you are able to edit at that given time. In addition to this, so you could actually see all the MIDI of each one of these tracks stacked on top of each other, but you'd only have the opportunity to edit for currently number 4. So let's just say I draw in stuff for number 4, and I go to number 3, and I start drawing in stuff for number 3. Really what it's going to look like when you're compounding these things is kind of this cluttery mess. But you very easily see who's who once you start to isolate them on an individual one-by-one basis, which is why these little options with the gray dots and the tracks field actually exist. But then it gets a little confusing as to who you're actually editing, so you have to kind of keep that in mind. Well, one more step to that, which is why I bring all this up. If this step input window does not reveal the number that you actually see here, you won't see anything happen. So that's an additional element that students complain about. They have step input assigned to a track. So let's say you assign the destination for step input to be instrument 1, but you have another instrument track open. If you have the Midi Editor open and you're not visibly seeing instrument 1, you actually won't see anything happen, but it is still going to happen. So we just have to make sure that when we use the Midi Editor, this shows the same thing as the destination track in order to keep that visual happening, so that you're actually keeping track of what takes place. Because here's the problem. Step input is a means of playing the piano without ever having to do it in real time, or playing the keys without having to do it in real time. So let me show you the basics of this function. It's really simple, although it just gets a little confusing if you didn't know those steps. So everybody got those steps so far? So step 1, we have to have the window open, right? Step 2 was? Yeah, well actually 2 was enable the checkbox. 3 was the destination track. By default, the enable box does not always come on engaged. So that's just one thing to note. Now, at that point in time, what we then need to do is we need to decide what type of note length or step increment, as they call it, but it's really just a note length that we would like to actually step into. So, oops. That's obviously something. step input is a means of you actually hitting the key, and then for every time you hit the key, you create something. And the duration of the note that you create is based upon that step increment. So when you see that step increment, that's what it's talking about. You also see that you have tuplets, meaning you could do things like triplets or 3 inside of 2. And you could do those items, and you can even set the velocity of how things are played as well. So as an example, let me just show you a step input performance to give you an idea of what this really means, and then I'll have you do it, and then we'll get a little technical with it. Step input at this point in time doesn't require you to technically begin the recording process by hitting Command Spacebar like you normally would, or even using the transport. Step input will be active at all times. That window is open and it's enabled, and you have a destination track. So if I sit down and do this, it went ahead and wrote that particular element that I just had performed. But it did it not in the amount of time it took me to play it. It did it based upon the note increment that I chose. So that's where the step increment is going to really come into play. How this is used in real life is really the next step. But go ahead and try that. You should just be able to hit your keys, and you should see all that stuff jump and be thrown into the step input. You see it in your Midi Editor. And then if you just back it up and push play, you'll hear exactly what happened.
I'm not hearing mine for some reason.
Were you hearing anything? Have you heard anything so far at all?
No.
You haven't heard anything? Brian, you might have this. Oh, you can hold on. Let's see. Oh, you're good to go.
Or is it?
No, well, you're good. You're showing that that's fine. Your outputs. So let's go to headphone 2 and see if that sometimes headphone 1 gets disconnected. Okay, now I see this. That makes no sense. So. Where are you at on these?
Yeah. You go to the.
This one.
Mm-hmm. And speak 4 hours.
Ryan, was yours working out okay?
Yeah.
I'm just messing with that. What did you play? Oh, you know what?
Did I not turn something on or something?
No, whoever had this last track,
Oh.
so it wasn't in the range of that particular sunset. So if you use try to go.
Okay. All right.
Well, now might be a good time to have that conversation anyway. If you guys, I don't know how many of you, I'll turn the light on real quick. You guys are going to eventually get into Audio 235. It's sound design and synthesis, and you should have this conversation. But in reference to how we use it for Pro Tools, these keyboard controllers, if they're ever in the on position when we're actually going to use them, please power them down and power them back on, because a lot of times the last user may have done something, and a lot of times those presets will kind of mess it up, like the octave shifting and stuff like that. But furthermore, on screen, it should say Pro Tools on the MIDI keyboard screen itself. What you'll see is, if you go and, well, I can show you on, like on yours right here. If you select load, and if you go and hit load, it's the left, yeah. What you'll see here is, you'll see as you scroll through these, which one is it? Oh, here it is, the E5 knob towards the bottom. There's actually one that actually says Pro Tools, and there's a PC Pads Pro Tools, and there's a Mac Pads Pro Tools, and the Mac Pads Pro Tools is number 2. That's the one you want to use when you're in Pro Tools, because they actually had built the architecture inside to work better with Pro Tools, so the transport works and operates correctly. Once you go to Reason, you're going to want to have the one, like if you're in Reason, which you guys learned about 2.5, you want to use the patch that says Reason, because it'll activate the transport for use. So what you're going to do with that is, in order to load that, there's a little thing at the top that says load, and it's got like a little gray bar that goes down to the F4 key. You just hit load, and once you hit load, it's good to go. You know, and nothing really changes for the most part. Like yours was on general MIDI. The only function that actually changes for you should be that the transport works. Although I think it's offline anyway, because you have to go into another window to open that up. But you'll also have the ability to use these for writing automation in the future. We have to still assign them which knobs are going to be working. But all that to say, just make sure you keep an eye on that, and that your octave is set to 0. Not your fault at all, Lisa. I didn't even catch that till towards the end. Some of the samplers will not play past a couple of octaves, especially if you're playing something that's been built upon something that's supposed to be real, because most instruments only have a 2-octave range. So a lot of times, outside of those 2 octaves, you won't get any sound at all. But looking at this, you guys kind of understand what's happening here?
Yes.
This can be helpful, it can also be painful. Depends on this really works if you're laying in things that are really not that crazy in terms of changing rhythms. because bouncing back and forth between types in the step increment takes a lot more work than it would to actually perform something. But one of the things that is really nice, that is very useful with this, is the fact that, and I just want to point this out to you, so for this will be for future use. If you hold any one key, although I didn't do that right. If you hold any one key and you add another key to it, and you add another key to it, and then you let go, what actually happens is it makes a chord. So that chord it doesn't get played the way that you heard it. It actually gets performed in one shot. And that actually proves to be very helpful. Although I forgot I'm on a monophonic device. Let me switch to something that'll actually play more than one note at a time. Alex Band's a good one. The beauty of this is that if you're trying to stack chords behind something, this really helps because of the fact that you can very easily do it. And I'm just going to jump down here and keep rocking on this step.
Switch the instrument.
I literally had to change the plugin altogether.
How do you change the plugin?
If you just clicked on the plugin that you were on, like as if you're bringing that down on the list, off to the left in that little box just beside it. Do you see it? No, on the left of the insert itself, in the insert location. Yeah, just to the left of it.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go. And then you just pick another one instead. But yeah, this will really give you the ability to jump in and do. So if we did something a little more elongated, like let's just say I do. I'm going to wipe all this out, and I'm going to do whole notes. Yeah, well, what you're able to do with this, pretty obviously, is notice I just did this little four bar deal. What I'm going to do to give you an idea of really how this will work is I'm going to jump in and I'm going to make another instrument. I'm going to change the sound on it so that I can get a little more. Let's see, we can just try. You know what? We'll try this one. I'm just going to add a little arpeggiation with this little ARP mode here. Drop the octave a little bit. Let me find something a little more tasteful. Okay, so let's just say I do that. I had already tracked the whole notes in that other section. So if I jump over to step input and I'm doing this on instead of instrument 1, I go to instrument 2, which is the one that I'm on. And I follow kind of the progression that's taking place here. I'm going to start from the beginning. Oh, whoops. All right. All right, there we go. All right, and then we'll kick it from the beginning. Oh, we gotta find out what progression that is. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna open up both these tracks so I can see both of them in one shot. Zoom out a little bit. Oops. Oh, I actually could have done that. So what is that? A-A-G. And it's, you kind of see how simple this is. I mean, it really makes life really easy for the, you know, really for everybody, even people who do play keys. Whoops. But for people, you know, who don't necessarily have the most experience, what you're seeing is it really allows you to kind of get in and start stacking stuff, because all you're really doing with step input is just applying it. Now, the only trick to step input is this. If you go to step input, and I'm just going to keep moving down the lane. If you go to step input and you play a performance and you're like, oh, you know what? Oh, I didn't like the last note. You want to use, instead of hitting Command Z, you want to do undo step, because if you hit Command Z, it's going to think of it as one entire thing. So watch what happens. So I just made a bunch of notes, right? Watch what happens if I hit Command Z. Notice it wiped them all out, which may not necessarily be what you want to do. So if you run into a thing where you're like, oh crap, I just messed it up, hit undo step, it'll take the last step out, and you can keep doing it. You actually end up with this. You end up with 99 undos in step input. The other catch to this that's helpful is, let's say you're playing a phrase, and I'm just going to go a little bit nuts with this. So I'm going to go pretty fast. Kind of give it a little something. All right? All right, now let's say I want to make I don't want to play the next note. I'd rather it be a space or rest in musical terms. If you hit next step, what it's going to do is it's going to skip the next available position and play the one that follows. So watch. If you can see, I'm going to zoom this in a little bit more so you can see it passing by. If I keep playing, notice they're all one after another in time. If I play, hit next step, I'm moving on to the next. And then if you want to do redo step, what it's going to do is it's going to actually allow you, and let's say I do this one. It should allow you to essentially redo or replace the step with the last available step. And I want you to understand that at this point in time, it would not be helpful to hit this section right here where it says none. I know it asks you to do this in the exercise, Lisa. I don't know if that made it complicated.
Yeah.
What makes this complicated is this is assigning these things like undo step. It assigns it to that key. So now if it says, like, see where it says note C1, if you click on it and hit a key, it's going to assign it to whatever key you hit. The downside is you can't play that key anymore. So what it means is every time you hit that particular key, it's going to undo the previous step. So if I keep hitting this key, instead of playing a new note, it will always do whatever the function is it's assigned to. So I would suggest to not use this unless you have a separate keyboard controller that will allow you to be responsible for it. And you can put this on a different octave or something that you're not currently using. Otherwise, every time you go to play C1, instead of adding a note, it's taking away. So that creates a bit of a problem.
What would that be useful?
If you had, well, let's say you had an 88 key or even a 66. Since we only had one octave,
Yeah.
you're only able to use these. If you had a full octave keyboard, you could just pick the ones to be assigned to be things that you know you're not going to play, like the lowest octave. And then you could just keep using that as a quick key while you're playing to help you get through the
Instead of going
process.
back and forth.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of even having to click on the screen. So that would be when it's useful. At this point in time, the controllers are just too small.
Okay.
You know, most of the time you're not going to want to give up any of those keys. You only have, 25 of them. So a lot of times you don't want to sacrifice them or give them away. Does that make sense? Did you guys have any questions? I mean, this was not rocket science, but the problem is that the way they built the architecture for it is it makes you do a few steps in order to be able to enable it. So a lot of times people go, well, I know there's an easy way to input MIDI without having to actually write it in, but I don't really know exactly how to use it. So does that make sense? So you guys feel like you could be functional with that? I know you already did the exercise for it, and you'll do the exercise, to get caught up with this.
How did you make that face or something like turn it into a regular?
Okay. So I suggest, for sure, when you guys get time, spend literally like an hour or two with each one of these, because I know that if you look at the virtual instrument list, you'll see there's a lot of different things going on. I would spend some time with these and get into their sounds. The one that I used here is kind of one of my favorite because it's simple, but I hate it because it doesn't sound realistic in some cases. I can get a little more out of some other stuff from it. So what it's great at is what you just heard. Fantastic at that. Synthesis, great. Once you get into the other stuff that's in here, it's kind of, that's okay. So you'll find that some of these have strengths and weaknesses. On this, over here, there's a lot of information that's in regards to which part of the patch is being used. So you can actually layer 4 on top of each other here to design one sound. And these numbers actually are referencing to the MIDI channel numbers, which you'll learn as soon as you get into advanced synthesis about how to map those numbers. But as we slide down, you'll see you have panning, the actual level of each one compared to each other. So panning left and right, effects 1 and 2, which are down at the bottom, and these are only useful if you turn them on. So if you turn effects 1 on, then you can turn effects 1 up on this channel and it works. But otherwise, if you don't ever do that, you won't have any effects anyway. So you click on this and pick different things down here to kind of do this thing, activate these. That way if you want some effects. As you move to the left, the first option that you see here is play, and this is a big deal, okay? This is a big deal because this gets screwed up if you do it wrong. The play, if you ever see anything that's performance or play in keyboard world, what that really means is your ability to transpose, typically, which is what that means. You see all that plus minus, plus minus. This is the fine tuning, meaning you can adjust these by sense. And then this is the actual transposition from performance to the actual heard sound. So if you want to play in the key of G, but you want to actually physically play in the key of C, something simple, you would actually adjust it there. So be careful. A lot of times you don't want to mess with this because it will really screw you up. In this, though, you're going to also see that the high-low keys are actually giving you the ability to map out which octaves are going to be used. So when you see this G8 to C-2, just know that if you go below C-2, you'll have no sound. If you go above G8, which at this point in time there's not, you guys won't have access to higher than that anyway, then you won't hear any sound. Over here you see which type of format it is. Monophonic or polyphonic, meaning monophonic meaning it only plays one note at a time. Polyphonic meaning you can play chords with it, more than one note at a time. You will want to pay particular attention to that because that changes by each patch that you switch. And I switched the patches here. I just clicked down and followed the thing and was able to switch patches. Now, as you get over here, jump down to Arpeggiate, it's the Arpeggiator. If you activate that by hitting the on button, which is this, you will begin to right away hear arpeggiation. And if you change the mode, you'll be able to switch what type of arpeggiation you're using to change that pattern. And then this is how fast. Your rate would be how fast. And then even furthermore, there is a modulator, so you can actually, if you go one down on that list, you can actually filter out certain parts of the sound to get a different sound altogether. So if I go into the modulation itself and adjust the filter. And there's a little bit of assignments being adjusted to the mod wheel. So if you go to the mod wheel, so notice that whatever's assigned there will be assigned to the mod wheel itself. So if you move the mod wheel on the side of the keyboard, one that says modulation while you're playing. Now over here where the filter's applied, it's based upon pressure. So the harder you hit it, so now if I hit it lightly, this is what it sounds like. If I hit it hard. But there's a couple of different things you can do with that. Panners. Now, another thing to note, at the top, you see something that's currently selected that says easy. It's giving you just some basic attack, decay. You know the ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, release. There's no sustain in this, but there is an attack, decay, and release. So more aggressive attacks, less aggressive attacks. How much decay? How much release? And you can set some of the envelope setups. Now, if you actually go to A, B, C, or D, which we're in A right now, you can actually set some more specific things that go with the type of patch. That's pretty much it with this one. This one's not this one's cool to get your hands on and really start working with. This one's not so intense that you get, too lost with it. But that's it, basically, for this. Now, where we're going next with this, though, is really critical. What happens after this point? And this gets us into Module 5. I'm going to go back to the loop recording for Module 4. So while I'm with MIDI, I'm going to hang with MIDI as we go into virtual instruments discussion in Module 5. The biggest thing about virtual instruments that's the reason that they have them is a great selling point for anybody who doesn't play anything, or let's say that doesn't have instruments to record or things like that, because obviously you can get your hands on a series of sounds right at your fingertips and start working. Well, the problem with it is that it is plug and play in the Mac world, and for PC it's somewhat, but a lot of times as soon as you add more than one virtual instrument, that's when things go wrong. That's when things get technical. So when you're doing it with just one virtual instrument and you just have one controller and you're just on a simple Mac setup, this is the easiest thing to do in the world. Once you add another, like we did, I don't know if you did this yet, go ahead and add, if you haven't already, add a new instrument track and go ahead and put a new instrument on it. Once we have an additional instrument, that's when things get complicated. And that's where we have to kind of have some of this discussion.
Just pick any instrument.
Yeah, anything's fine. that make sense? You have a new one right now. Now here's where it gets into the nitty gritty. Okay? The nitty gritty really is this. You can go ahead and close step input for now, because we won't really need it as much. Down at the bottom in the mix window view selector, it's at the bottom left corner. It's this little teeny window right here, and you can also access it. It's right here at the bottom, mix window view selector. And you can also access it if you go to view in the menu system, view, and then down to where it says view, mix window views. What we want to see is we want to see instruments. So go ahead and click on the thing that says instruments. So this is going to show us technically a little bit of detail, and it gets a little different. Okay, this I need you to know. For a MIDI track, let me make a MIDI track for you that way you can see it. For a MIDI track, well, I'll start from the beginning. For an audio track, for an audio track, where is the I/O routing? How do I map the in and out on the audio track?
Do the sends?
No. Well, sends are additional outputs, but they don't control any inputs, and they're not the main out.
Wouldn't that be the I/O?
Yeah, absolutely. So that I/O for an audio track represents analog audio, right? I/O. What do you think the I/O from a MIDI standpoint, like MIDI controllers, MIDI channel inputs that are coming in off an actual MIDI cable? For the MIDI channel, where do you think the I/O resides for MIDI? What's, well, it's in the same. It's actually in the same location, in the same spot as audio, except that it's, instead of this being audio right here, this ends up being the MIDI I/O path. Does that make sense? So this is audio I/O, and what it refers to is it refers to analog inputs and outputs. This is the MIDI I/O, which refers to, and this is where it gets interesting, it refers to MIDI inputs, which are 1 through 16. You guys should have learned about basic MIDI stuff. There's MIDI carries 16 channels. So it has these particular channels, and then you'll see which devices are accessible. You guys have a different listing, but these are all the options for MIDI coming in for me on the 03 in the back. But this output is also MIDI out. It's not analog out. Because on a MIDI channel it's data only, right? So we actually have to go somewhere with the data first before we can get audio on the return. So there's no audio out on this. What it means is it's going to have a MIDI input. At this point in time, if we say all, that just means any MIDI signal that comes through at all. It's the safest way to do it. Any MIDI signal coming in will be sent to that channel. It's a real safe, easy way to do it. And the way to actually use that and record it is to actually have it record enabled, so you can isolate who's getting recorded at one time, at each instance. But on the output, notice something familiar.
Both sharing the same channel.
Well, technically they're both saying, they say channel 1, but they say expand to 1, expand to 2. And what that means is it's saying the first virtual instrument is going to be number 1, expand to number 1, and the second one's going to be expand to number 2. So I actually have the options of jumping into those from this MIDI channel here. So to be clear, the audio channel, I/O is analog in, analog out. The MIDI channel is MIDI in, MIDI out. The only reason we're having this discussion is because the instrument channel is the hybrid between the two. What happens with the instrument channel is this. The instrument channel uses this part of the I/O for analog. So what you see here when you're on an instrument channel, when you're using a virtual instrument, this is audio. And the MIDI I/O resides up at the top when you open up the view to see instruments. So at the top is MIDI I/O, at the bottom, where you normally have this I/O strip, is analog I/O. Now, there's a catch to that. The catch to that is you can't use an audio input at the same time you're using a MIDI input stream. Because it would make two inputs on the same channel and one would take over. The one that would take over technically would be the audio if the audio is actually sending signal. And MIDI if the MIDI sending signal. So they'll combat each other, they'll literally fight the whole time. So we normally, in normal operations, leave this at no input and make sure this says out, either out 1 and 2 or wherever it's being assigned. At this point in time, it's analog out 1 and 2, which is the main mix. And the thing we focus on is at the top. And that's why you didn't see it when you opened it up, right? When the mix window was open, it doesn't naturally come up, so you have to open it. So what it's saying at the very, very top is it's saying MIDI input, and you guys have this, it should say all, right? Which means what again? I mentioned it a second ago. What does it all mean again from a MIDI input standpoint?
It means all of the MIDI that's coming in.
Okay.
Is that?
Kind of. So say it in another way. Do you have another way to say it? I mean, yes.
All the MIDI that's available to.
Okay. Absolutely. So what? Okay. So then answer this. What happens if we have 5 MIDI keyboard controllers connected to the same computer, and we push a key on any one of them?
Oh, one of them's gonna play.
Well, what happens with the all selected if we have all these controllers connected to the same computer and we push a key?
Overload something.
Well, technically no. Surprisingly, they work out kind of in an interesting way.
So they're all going through the same.
Yeah, but only one was being played.
Okay.
So if I took this whole row and I routed all these to the same Pro Tools system, and I have all selected, I push the key on any one of them, and then what happens? Exactly, they play. It plays through that channel.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Catch what that is. If you then took all these controllers and you played this one and you played that one, they'll still all feed the same channel, which means you're going to add duplications of signal or data, and it'll capture all of it. It'll take all of it. It really won't overload to any point that we'd have to worry about because the file size is so minimal, and because it's not audio, it's not going to hurt anybody. What may happen is on the other side, the virtual instrument may freak out and send a lot of signal, but since it's only one input, it's not really going to hurt anything either, really, because it's only one. If it was like a whole bunch of them, it would look different. But then ask the question this, okay? This is where it gets technical. All is your safe bet if you have no idea and you just want it the easiest way to get signal in, right? All becomes very useless as soon as you add more than one controller and you want them to do something specific so that every time you play them, they actually play the device that you would like. So you're going to predefine, see where it says predefine, you're going to use these as predefined ports if you ever want something to be specific so that this controller controls this sound and that controller controls that sound. Does that make sense?
It like separates it.
Absolutely. So they're individually, so it's as if this is assigned to just one whole thing and that one's assigned to another. The catch with this, because there's a lot of them, is this. All is the best bet, and notice it's the default for inputting. There are several ways to get zero, nada, from the MIDI. One is this is a mute for the MIDI input. And they put it, I'll tell you this, you know why they put a mute on the MIDI input? Because if a whole bunch of tracks have all assigned to them, and you play your keyboard, and they all take the same signal at the same time, you're going to hear all of them. So a lot of times, this is designed so that you really only hear the one that you record enabled, but if you never record enable any, it should automatically default to the first. But there are often times when you do the routing that they all fire at the same time, so you just simply mute the ones you don't want at any given time, which is why this exists. I'll tell you, I rarely have to use this because if it's set up right, it's easy to do. But there's a catch. In the options menu, if you do not have MIDI through selected, this is kind of an interesting thing. MIDI through is only useful for two things. One, virtual instruments, period. And two, if you're using a MIDI track and you want to send the MIDI through the unit. It sounds like a silly idea, but you'd have to understand a little bit more about MIDI to kind of catch the drift why there's a through in the first place. But you have to have, this is options, MIDI through. It has to be selected in order to use a virtual instrument with your keyboard controller. Otherwise you'll get nothing. The reason for this is because when they designed this architecture, they basically built it to be a system that enacts the virtual instrument as if it was part of the MIDI signal path, so that there's a MIDI data. I'll take it back 2 steps. MIDI through. Have you ever heard of it?
It was in the book.
Okay, well, and then for further reading, there you go. MIDI input is just like audio input. It's a data being put into something, right? And MIDI output is just like audio output. It's a data coming from something. But the thing about it is in the audio world, this computer system is the only thing that you'd ever send audio to and then from and have it come back around again. It's the only possibility for it. So it's kind of one of those things that in the real world you never do that. Like if you were playing an instrument and you plugged it into a PA, you would never want to recycle the signal back to you and then send it in a loop. But MIDI does, because it likes to send, and it's kind of a misgiven idea that there's a MIDI in and there's a MIDI out. USB carries both of them in one shot. It does MIDI in and MIDI out simultaneously. So if you're ever wondering why there's a MIDI in and a MIDI out, but there's only one cable, USB does it, well, it's not simultaneous. They do it in shots. It's here's in, here's out, here's in, here's out, because they can't stream. USB 3 does that, where they go at the same time. USB 2 does not. But all that to say, technically there's a MIDI in and a MIDI out. And so the problem with it is that with the MIDI in, like imagine this, if you send a MIDI into something, and then you send a MIDI out of something, technically what happens is the MIDI in that's coming in does not carry through to the device and go back out the out. What it does is it goes into the in and it does something at the keyboard controller in the analog world. Once it's done with that, anything that's done from the keyboard authentically, meaning you play it, is firing out of the out. As soon as you click through, then it activates the ability to send something to a device, through it, and back out of it in the same shot. The reason we have to have this for the virtual instrument is because when you do the input for all, imagine where the editor, or the Midi Editor or the edit window plays a role in this. When you push record on an instrument track, what do you record? Yeah. Data, MIDI, not audio. Even though the virtual instrument path is down here at the bottom, or it's at the top, but it's lower than the MIDI path. So notice it'll go MIDI in, and that MIDI in gets sent directly to the recording platform to be recorded. So it goes MIDI in to the recorder. It doesn't go MIDI in to the virtual instrument and then to the recorder. It goes MIDI in to be recorded. Then it goes, at that point in time, underneath it, where it says the next one below it, it's MIDI out. This is MIDI out right here. It goes to the device that you have selected here. In order for that to work, you have to activate through. Because again, like I said, if you do a MIDI in, normally it's an isolated signal, and a MIDI out is an isolated signal. If you go to through, it goes MIDI in and it takes it to the out, which is exactly what you need. And then it plays it as a piece of audio. So everything below here, everything that happens below acts as if it's just audio, not MIDI. So this is all audio. Does that make sense? Above is MIDI.
So it's actually in the sequence of the path is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, well, and if you can see it that way, then your understanding of this will be very easily mastered. The way that this is set up, it doesn't give you any clues or hints to the fact that where you get printed is actually from the top. Because that's not the normal way that it does it in the audio world. And that's why we just kind of had to isolate, this is what this looks like, this is what this looks like, and this is how this actually works. Now, there's a little bit of an advanced thing that happens here that can be good and bad. Notice, this is, if I go and open this, at the very top, see where it says MIDI node, it says expand to number 1. And if you have something that's not this, you should still see it say, like yours says hybrid 1, where it says MIDI node. What does yours say? You see MIDI node at the top?
Yeah, mine says MIDI node vacuum one.
Exactly, okay. So keep an eye on that for a sec. All right, and go to, if you open another one, open that one up and read the number on that, or read whatever it says. It could be a completely different device.
Expand 2-1.
Yeah, okay, expand to 1. And what was your, did you have one yet, Lisa?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, click on it, not off to the left of it. Like, it's dead center. Yeah, there you go.
Midi note expand to 1.
Okay, so at this point in time, what you should be seeing is you should see that this Midi Out matches the plugin that's below it. The virtual instrument that's below it, right? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, do this with me. Switch it to the opposite one. Go in and hit channel 1 on it. Switch it to the opposite one. Switch it to, so for yours, whatever, go to your first track and make the output be whatever the device is on the second track. Yeah, so see where that little dot is? No, see where the little dot is up top? Yeah. Yeah, that's the one you're on. Go to the one above it.
Go down.
Yep. And then go to the other one and do the same thing.
And then switch it to the first one.
Yep. And you're gonna go to channel 1 now. Okay, so all this is, all I'm doing with this is I just want to show you that at any point in time, and this is even after you record something, so if you already had something recorded there, you can literally switch it to a different side. So if I back mine up, what's happening is the signal's actually, and I'll mute this real quick. Notice I'm muting this signal, and this channel, let's go to this channel. What's that?
Rerouting it.
Absolutely.
Mine didn't do that at all.
Because it's a MIDI out. Well, let's see the outs.
It's still hard to explain.
Well, it depends on what's going on with the window itself. If we look at it. Okay.
Oh, there it is. How did you change that?
I don't know. I just switched. It might have taken a while to get going. But all that to say, there's good news and bad news about this. The good news is, well, okay, let me start with the bad news. The bad news is Pro Tools is like that thing that you expect to always automatically do everything correctly that almost 80% of the time will not.
Good one.
And so with that in mind, if you ever find that you're on a channel and you can't figure out why is it playing the wrong channel, the first place you need to look is up in the instruments for the MIDI out. Furthermore, if you're not getting a controller in, MIDI in is another go-to place. Now, week 1 we talked about telling Pro Tools where to go. And Ryan, that's kind of it's a concept that we talked a lot about because we need to tell Pro Tools where to go. Where to go when we save it, where to go when we route it, where to go when we do MIDI in and out. I mean, on analog. Exactly. And here's the problem. It will do lots of stuff off the cuff. As soon as you open it up, by default it'll do a lot of stuff. But if you never understand that it's doing it because you're making it, you really will have some issues that will drive you nuts for a whole day that you can't figure out. Now, this is the reason that any of this is important. Virtual instruments pull a lot of resources in Pro Tools. So if I go down to Window and I just go look at the disk usage, I'm sorry, the system usage. Well, watch what happens. I'm going to add some more instruments. Right now I'm at 1% and I'm sitting idle.
Now, would this have to do with usage and latency and all that stuff?
Absolutely. It will deal with the playback engine the way that we talked about it in terms of having to boost the buffer size when we had that buffer size conversation. The more that you add, the higher your percentage will go, but you're really going to start to see a spike. And I only have 4 bars, so it's nothing crazy, but as soon as you start to stack these things up, you really begin to kind of bog down on the system. So here's the thing the takeaway from all this. If you decide that, you know what, I want to do a lot of layers, but I just want to do it on the same sound, you can do them individually track by track and isolate just one instrument. So let's just say let's just say we want this to be our one instrument, and then I'll show you a couple other ways to do this, because there's a few other ways to do this. I'm going to get rid of all this other crap. Basically what I can do with this is I can have all of these be assigned to expand 2.
And have it go through that
Yep.
on one channel.
Yep, and they'll all their MIDI will still exist on their individual channels, but they'll be sent to one virtual instrument. It kind of keeps some of that simple. There's another step to this, though, that really comes into play that allows us to do even more with this. With the expand, I know we just talked about this a little bit. Notice that this says channel 1. We can actually, on one single device, which is why this one's kind of a nice thing, we can break these out so they say 1, 2, 3, 4. And we can actually go in and create all sorts of different parts or sounds. They're all going to be assigned to their individual channel. And if you go then to the, if you then go to the outputs, notice they all have a channel assigned. That's what that refers to. So notice expand 2 channel 1 is going to be the dirt monster. If I go to the next one and make it 2, it's going to be electric blown. And literally I'm just going to make these, do their thing.
So when you, now it's only up to 4 because you only have 4 tracks, right?
Well, this one will only do up to 4.
Oh, okay.
This one will only do up to 4, unfortunately. You can go ahead and balance these right off of the device. And you can do panning right off the device, which is why they even have this in the first place. There's nothing in that other channel.
Sounds like
But that's exactly how that, you could really do a lot with it, if you think about it. There's only one other catch I forgot to mention. There's one other element that we have to add into all this, and this is a more advanced concept. This one's a more advanced concept, so before I move on, questions? You guys okay with this? You understand how you have to route this for the instrument I know? Okay. If you go to setup and you go down to MIDI and you go to the MIDI input devices, this is your listing for what, now this essentially is the only location for anything that will make it to Pro Tools. So if your device, like let's say you went out and bought this device and you were going to come in and plug it into your computer, if when you plug it in and turn it on, it does not appear on this list, it will not be activated for use with Pro Tools. Meaning you can sit here all day and try to make it work. If it's not on the list, it's not enabled for MIDI input. Does that make sense?
So it's waiting outside the line of the club.
Yeah, well, and so yes, so you won't have any access to it. The reason this is important is for people like me, for maybe people like you in the future, if you use Pro Tools in conjunction with other software like Reason or Live or Fruity Loops or any of those other things, what will happen is those DAWs will also harbor their own input list. The problem with it is if you have both active, they'll both fire MIDI. And it's different than firing MIDI in the all sequence in the same DAW than it is to fire 2 different sets in 2 different DAWs. What will happen is they'll both play, they'll both fire, and they'll literally have latency between the 2 of them that will cause everything that you play to basically sound like it's phasing, like it's constantly going like you'll know phasing when you hear it. That's exactly what it does. So a lot of times it depends on who you're recording it to, you have to either come into here and deactivate them, or you have to go into their DAW and deactivate them. In order to activate things that do not exist on this list, that may be your next question. If it doesn't show up on the list, how do we get it on the list? So, first of all, setup, MIDI input enable. We have to have it on this list. That's how you check. It's in setup. Sounds easy because it's in the setup menu. So if you ever think, oh crap, how do I get my MIDI set up? You should go to the setup menu and then go to MIDI. This is where we kind of jump into the next thing. Midi Studio. You may have seen this before or had some sort of conversation about it. The Midi Studio, it's kind of interesting. This is the audio MIDI setup. It's the Midi Studio. It is located in your PC system and in your Mac system when you buy the system. So it's actually not even a Pro Tools isolated thing. It is built into the computer, basically the organs of the applications of the computer, because they expect you to use this in one way, shape, or form. So notice it's both audio and MIDI. The only thing we're concerned about is the MIDI. So the MIDI section is off to the right here. It says Midi Studio. What you want to do is you want to make sure that you see your device actually connected to something in here that if it's a physical wire, like if you actually went and routed actual MIDI cables, okay, not USB, but actual MIDI cables, okay, if you actually use those, you have to have it look like this with this wired thing. The reason this actually has a wired one is because the keyboard in the back is actually physically wired. The controller that we have is USB. This is the controller. So if it's just a controller, no MIDI, you can have it sit standalone with nothing connected. If it was used with MIDI cables, you actually need the MIDI in and out to match. So you basically say like, this is output 1. Obviously it's out because it's pointing out. It has to match into an input for one of the channels. And then you basically have to do the same thing here. Does that make sense? You have to, and that's how it's saying it'll receive connection. If you need to add a device, you'll just go add device, you'll double click it, and you'll tell it what type of device. You'll name it, okay, so you'll actually put a name. And then you'll look for the manufacturer. This is a big key element, okay? Who makes it? Okay, well let's look. Let's just say it's a Roland, okay? And then what model? And then they're going to give you a listing. All right, and you're going to go, oh, this is the RD700. What it should do is if you find the name, the make, and the model, it should set up all the elements that you need right away. So that you don't have to do much other than hit apply, and you're good to go. But there's a couple things to add to that. If you hit General MIDI, this is the most generic version of MIDI. It pretty much is a bulletproof way to have your MIDI work. You hit General MIDI. You don't want MIDI machine control unless you actually have a MIDI machine control on it, and you would know it by reading the manual of the device. It would say that it actually could do MMC, is what they call it, MIDI machine control, MMC. Now notice on here, it talks about the channels, 1 through 16. They aren't always activated all of them, unless you manually come in and do them. So a lot of times you want to say, hey, let's activate all these, so that all 16 are enabled. Does that make sense? And then ports, depending upon if there are additional ports, this would be a listing. Most of the time there are not, or there may be one that already be in there. So as long as you have this and you have General MIDI, as long as you hit apply, you're good to go, and then your device has its name, like I just called it name, and now it's ready to work. And what you'll end up doing with that is you'll end up seeing this. Now, the reason mine won't show, unfortunately, you should see it in the listing as long as it's a valid something. Because this one's not a valid anything at all, I don't think it's going to show, yeah, it's not going to show you anything here because I don't even have a listing for it here. And there's one more thing I needed to add to this. Oh, in this window, what you can do is if you go to Rescan Midi, a lot of times the first time you put something in, if you hit Rescan Midi, it will scan, it'll pick up who's already connected, and it'll do it for you. At that point in time, you can hit Test the Midi Setup. What you're going to do is if you push play, or you play any note, it'll actually show in the test window, it'll blink. You'll see it blink. It won't be using this. But other than that, you're just, going to have a happy time with MIDI. Does that make sense? It's pretty simple. It's nothing too bad. Oh, the new external device looks like it's the one that's listed up there, but this one was never named, the one that's external, so it still shows. Here's the only catch that I see with these, that I run into all the time with these. These are getting changed all the time, so probably about every 6 months they have a new version of what these are. One of the things that you'll see here is they keep expanding the ports and what's being done. So notice where it says hypercontrol in. That's their quote-unquote technology that belongs to these devices. It says hypercontrol here. Hypercontrol refers to this stuff. So when you're looking at hypercontrol ports, the only thing it has to do with is a transport. For other technologies, they'll have another name for something, and it'll get put in the listing, and it'll be something for whatever the device does. Like they'll come up with a new feature, and they'll be like, well, this device has automated faders built into it. The 143 room has a bunch of controls like that, and those will be the listings. So notice it is in the MIDI input enabled, but it is sending MIDI signal. It's just not something that you use to record MIDI. Does that make sense? So you're looking for the ones that say USB if they're USB. And if you want to, because you can actually use these, there are ports on a lot of these on the back of them. So there is an actual port. So notice where it says Axiom Pro external in, that's what that is. So there's actual, the external port, which is a physical port that actually allows MIDI to come in as well. So now that we're all geniuses on this, we're going to take a quick dinner break.
Thank you.
We're gonna come back at 8 o'clock.